Putin explodes at BRICS. Putin leaves NATO, journalist speechless. During the recent BRICS summit, a British journalist dared to question Vladimir Putin about Russia's positions and actions on critical issues in international politics, such as the conflict in Ukraine, the expansion of NATO, and the effects of European security policy. This journalist raised direct questions about the contradictions he perceives in Russian actions compared to the principles of peace and security expressed in the summit's speeches. Putin, in response, frankly addressed each accusation, offering his own perspective and questioning Western policies in turn. In his introduction, the journalist recalled Putin's recent statement in which Russia expresses its commitment to stability and security, and pointed out the apparent contradiction of these principles with Russian military interventions, especially in Ukraine. The journalist, a representative of the BBC, challenged Putin by asking how the motto of stability and justice corresponds to the events of recent years, from the Russian intervention in Crimea to the recent intensification of the conflict in Ukraine. In his response, Putin not only defended Russia's actions but also tried to turn the criticism around, pointing out the lack of self-criticism in Western powers and arguing that their own national security interests have been systematically ignored by the West. Putin stressed the importance of Russian sovereignty, which he considers fundamental to the survival and security of his country. From his perspective, NATO, led by the United States, has sought to expand further and further into Eastern Europe, bringing military bases closer to Russia's borders, despite promises made decades ago not to expand the alliance. This, he assured, has put Russia in a defensive position, feeling cornered by Western expansion. In his view, this threat is something that any sovereign country would try to neutralize, and therefore justifies Russia's actions within the framework of what he calls a prolonged self-defense. Another topic that Putin addressed in detail was the global economic crisis, pointing out the effects of the financial and monetary policies of the United States and the Eurozone, especially since the pandemic. Putin argued that with the massive issuance of dollars and euros to rescue their economies, the West generated inflation and a rise in the prices of essential goods that affected countries around the world, especially developing economies. He stated that these irresponsible practices by developed countries have caused instability that is now affecting millions, criticizing the fact that, despite their speeches about justice and international aid, Western nations put their economic interest before the global effects of their decisions. Putin also denounced what, in his opinion, is hypocrisy in the way the West handles freedom of the press and transparency of information. Often, he said, Russia is portrayed as a closed and hostile country towards journalists, where freedom of the press is restricted. However, he assured that this dialogue with a British journalist in which sensitive issues were discussed without censorship is proof of Russian openness. He contrasted this supposed openness with what he described as restrictions in the West, where he believes that many journalists and media outlets cannot openly criticize their government's policies. For Putin, this type of open interview in Russia belies accusations of censorship and shows that the press in his country can address uncomfortable issues without fear of reprisals. Another relevant aspect that Putin discussed was the energy policy of the European Union, which, according to him, is contradictory. Europe has promoted a green energy agenda, closing nuclear power plants and reducing its dependence on coal. But at the same time, it depends on energy imports from other countries. Putin stated that Europe has not adequately considered the consequences of this policy, which has led to a significant dependence on foreign energy sources, including Russian ones. In his opinion, this strategy has weakened European economies and created vulnerabilities that, when tensions with Russia increased, resulted in an energy crisis that continues to affect European citizens. In his response to the journalist, Putin suggested that this European policy is an example of how Western nations are willing to impose their environmental agenda on other countries without measuring the consequences. He mentioned that this same attitude has had devastating effects on emerging economies, which are required to reduce their use of hydrocarbons or adopt green technologies without providing them with financial support to achieve these objectives. This type of intervention, Putin argued, is an example of economic neocolonialism, in which Western nations impose policies that benefit their interests without considering the difficulties they pose for developing countries. Another point that Putin touched on was the presence of BRICS as an alternative to the current world power structure. Unlike NATO countries, the members of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, seek to foster relationships based on mutual respect and cooperation, without imposing their political or economic models. According to Putin, BRICS represents a way for developing countries to have a voice in global affairs without being subject to Western conditions. He argued that this type of alliance allows for a fairer and freer exchange from the conditions that usually accompany aid and treaties from Western countries. Throughout this summit, and particularly in his exchange with the British journalist, Putin tried to present Russia as a nation in defense of a multipolar world order. He argued that the Western approach, which tends to intervene in other countries and sanction those who do not align with their policies, does not contribute to a safer or more equitable world. He criticized that under the pretext of security, NATO and the United States have intervened in several nations and justified the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia as part of a policy of harassment towards any country that seeks to maintain its autonomy. In short, this dialogue at the BRICS summit showed the deep differences between the approach of Russia and that of Western countries in terms of security, the economy, and national sovereignty. While the British journalist embodied the concerns of Western countries about Russia's actions, Putin defended each of his points of view as a legitimate response to the perceived hostility from the West. With this type of argument, Putin sought not only to answer the questions that make many in the West uncomfortable, but also to influence international public opinion to see Russia and BRICS as an alternative to what he describes as the unilateral domination of the world.